December 8, 1941. The radio waves across the Pacific crackled with a message that shattered the world. Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is no drill. But thousands of miles west, in the Philippines, the nightmare was just beginning. The United States Asiatic Fleet, outgunned and aging, was forced to retreat south or face annihilation. The skies belonged to the Japanese Zeros. The seas belonged to the Imperial Navy's battleships and cruisers. Left behind to defend the crumbling fortress of Corregidor and the starving troops on Bataan was a tiny ragtag force that seemed like a bad joke. Mover Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. They had 6 boats against the entire might of the Japanese Empire. These were the PT boats. They were 80 feet of mahogany plywood, fueled by highly flammable 100-octane aviation gas and armed with 4 torpedoes. They were fast, capable of 40 knots, but they were fragile. A single splinter of steel from a destroyer's gun could turn them into a fireball. The Japanese commanders, peering through their binoculars from the bridges of their heavy cruisers, were initially confused. They saw small white wakes tearing across the water at impossible speeds. They didn't believe the Americans would dare attack capital ships with what looked like pleasure craft. But Lieutenant John Bulkley, the commander of Squadron 3, was not interested in pleasure. He was interested in survival. Night after night, Bulkley and his Mosquito Fleet roared out of the hidden coves of Bataan. They operated in pitch blackness, guided only by the phosphorescence of the water and the silhouette of enemy ships against the stars. The roar of their 3 Packard engines sounded like a freight train, terrifying the Japanese sailors who couldn't track the small, elusive targets. On January 18, 1942, Bulkley's men did the unthinkable. In the darkness of Binanga Bay, they engaged a 5,000-ton Japanese cruiser. It was David versus Goliath. The PT boat unleashed its torpedoes and spun away under a hail of machine gun fire. The cruiser erupted. It was the first time in history a small motorboat had sunk a capital ship. The Japanese were stunned. The Green Dragons, as the enemy began to call them, were real. But bravery couldn't stop the inevitable. By March 1942, Bataan was collapsing. The troops were eating lizards and monkeys. Ammunition was gone. General Douglas MacArthur, the symbol of Allied resistance in the Pacific, was trapped on the island fortress of Corregidor. If the Japanese captured him, it would be a propaganda victory that could lose the war. Washington ordered MacArthur to leave, but how? The airfields were destroyed. The sea was blockaded by Japanese destroyers. A submarine was too slow and too risky in the shallow mined waters. There was only one option left, the Mosquito Fleet. On the night of March 11, 1942, General MacArthur, his family, and his staff walked down to the dock. MacArthur looked at the tiny, battered PT-41 boat bobbing in the water. It looked like a coffin. He turned to Bulkley and asked, "You can make it?" Bulkley simply nodded. "I'll get you there, General." What followed was a 560-mile nightmare. Overloaded with passengers and fuel drums strapped to the decks, the 4 remaining PT boats set off into the teeth of a gale. Waves 15 feet high smashed over the plywood hulls. The generals were violently seasick. The engines, clogged with bad fuel and rust, began to fail. They were sailing blind through a Japanese blockade. At one point, a Japanese heavy cruiser spotted the wake of the lead boat. The horizon lit up with searchlights. Bulkley cut the engines, and the boat sat silent in the darkness, bobbing like a piece of driftwood as the steel monster passed just a few hundred yards. For 2 days and 2 nights, they battled the ocean and the enemy. The squadron became separated. One boat had to be abandoned, but against all odds, Bulkeley navigated by dead reckoning to the island of Mindanao. When a B-17 bomber finally picked MacArthur up to fly him to Australia, the general turned to the dirty, exhausted men of the PT boats. They were the ones staying behind. They had no torpedoes left. They had no fuel. They were the Expendables. MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return," was made possible only because 6 plywood boats and a handful of fearless sailors had dared to challenge an empire. The Mosquito Fleet had lost their boats, but they had saved the hope of the Pacific. The Japanese were no longer laughing at the toy boats. They were hunting them. The Marines, rotting in the foxholes of Guadalcanal, called it the Slot. On the maps, it was New Georgia Sound, a narrow channel of water running down the center of the Solomon Islands. But to the crews of the PT boats stationed at the primitive base on Tulagi, it was simply Hell's Highway. By August 1942, the U.S. Navy was bleeding. In a series of disastrous night battles, the Japanese Imperial Navy had shattered the Allied fleet, sinking so many cruisers and destroyers that the waters north of Guadalcanal were renamed Iron Bottom Sound. During the day, American planes ruled the sky, but when the sun set, the ocean belonged to the Empire. Every night, like clockwork, the Tokyo Express would steam down the Slot. These were not cargo ships. They were heavily armed destroyers, packed with thousands of fresh Japanese troops and supplies. They came in fast, unloaded in the dark, and bombarded the American airfield, Henderson Field, before vanishing before dawn. The only thing standing in their way were the Green Dragons. The Japanese sailors, peering into the inky blackness from the bridges of their destroyers, had begun to dread the sound. It wasn't the deep thrum of a warship. It was a low, muffled burble that suddenly exploded into a roar. It was the sound of 3 12-cylinder Packard engines screaming to life. For the crews of the PT boats, the nights were a cast of nerves that bordered on torture. They lay in wait in the shadows of the islands, engines idling, rocking in the tropical swells. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of mildew, sweat, and high-octane gasoline. Then the radar would blip, or a lookout would spot a shadow darker than the night. Target bearing 300. The tactics were suicidal. While a destroyer could engage targets from 10 miles away, a PT boat had to get within hundreds of yards to fire its Mark 8 torpedoes. They had to charge into the teeth of the enemy's guns. One such night in October 1942 encapsulates the madness. A squadron of PT boats commanded by Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery detected a column of Japanese destroyers tearing down the Slot at 30 knots. "Open fire!" The PT boats surged from the darkness. They were wooden splinters charging against steel mountains. As they released their torpedoes, the Japanese destroyers reacted instantly. Searchlights, blindingly bright beams of white light, snapped on, catching the small boats in their glare. Suddenly, the night turned to day. The water around the PT boats erupted in geysers as 5-inch shells slammed into the sea. The air filled with the terrifying crack thump of high-velocity rounds passing through the plywood hulls. But the PT boats didn't turn back. They zigzagged wildly, laying down a smokescreen that choked the Japanese gunners. The boat's gunners, strapped into their turrets, returned fire with everything they had: twin 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons raking the decks of the Japanese ships. They couldn't sink a destroyer with bullets, but they could kill the men on the bridge. They could shatter the searchlights. They could cause chaos. The Japanese captains were stunned by the ferocity. They were used to fighting battleships, not these stinging insects that swarmed from every direction.
The presence of the PT boats forced the Tokyo Express to break formation. They had to maneuver to avoid torpedoes, wasting precious time. Instead of unloading their troops in an hour, they were fighting for their lives for 3. In the confusion, torpedoes often missed or failed to detonate, a curse of early American ordnance. But the psychological victory was absolute. The Japanese began to report that the Americans had developed a new secret weapon. They called them the Devil Boats. By the time the sun rose, the Tokyo Express had fled, often leaving half their supplies undelivered. The PT boats would limp back to Tulagi, their hulls riddled with shrapnel, their crews deafened and shaking from adrenaline. They hadn't won the war that night, but they had denied the enemy the sea. The nightmare in the slot was no longer just for the Americans. The PT boats had made sure the Japanese were afraid of the dark, too.
To the admirals of the Japanese Imperial Navy, the concept was laughable. Warships were built of steel. They were armored behemoths designed to take a hit from a 14-inch shell and keep fighting. The Americans, in their desperation, had sent children to fight samurai in boats made of plywood. But by 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Japanese sailors had a new name for the American PT boats. They called them the Devil Boats. The PT boat was an engineering paradox. It was 80 feet of mahogany, layered like a refined piece of furniture, held together by thousands of copper screws and glue. It had no armor. A rifle bullet could pass through one side and out the other. Its protection was not steel plating. It was pure, unadulterated speed. Deep in the hull sat 3 massive 12-cylinder Packard engines, essentially aircraft engines modified for marine use. They guzzled 100-octane aviation gasoline, the most volatile fuel on Earth. The crews knew the grim math. One spark, one tracer round in the fuel tank, and the boat wouldn't just sink, it would vaporize. They were riding 3,000 gallons of liquid explosive. This fragility dictated their tactics. You do not fight a fair fight in a PT boat. You fight like a knife fighter in a dark alley. The Devil Boat crews perfected the art of the silent stalk. In the moonless nights of the Solomon Islands, they would patrol with their engines muffled, exhaust buried underwater to suppress the roar. They drifted in the shadows of the islands, waiting for the Tokyo Express, the Japanese destroyers resupplying their troops. The tactic was terrifyingly simple. Wait until the massive silhouette of a destroyer appeared against the stars. Wait until you could hear the voices of the Japanese lookouts. Wait until your heart was hammering against your ribs. Then and only then did you unleash hell. "Kick it!" the skipper would scream. The motormax in the engine room would slam the throttles forward. The Packards would scream from a low rumble to a deafening roar. The bow of the boat would lift out of the water, creating a massive rooster tail of white spray. In seconds, the boat would accelerate from idle to 40 knots. It was like driving a sports car on a sheet of ice. The gunners, strapped into their turrets, would open fire. They knew their 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons couldn't sink a destroyer, but they could blind it. They would rake the bridge of the Japanese ship, shattering the searchlights, killing the officers, and sowing chaos. While the Japanese gunners struggled to depress their heavy cannons low enough to hit the speeding, zigzagging wooden boats, the PTs would launch their Mark 8 torpedoes. These torpedoes were heavy, slow, and unreliable, but at point-blank range, they didn't need to be perfect, they just needed to be close. The escape was the hardest part. After firing, the PT boat would bank hard, heeling over so far the gunwales touched the water and run for the cover of the reefs.
The Japanese destroyers, with their deep drafts, couldn't follow them into the shallow coral waters. They could only fire their massive guns in frustration, churning the water behind the fleeing mosquitoes. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese crews began to dread the night. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't relax. They knew that anywhere the water was shallow, the devil boats could be waiting. The Americans paid a heavy price for this reputation. The plywood hulls absorbed water and rotted in the tropical heat. The engines broke down constantly. The crews suffered from malaria, dengue fever, and saltwater ulcers. But they had achieved the impossible. They had taken a boat designed for pleasure cruising, armed it with the weapons of a battleship, and forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to look over its shoulder in fear. The plywood had held against the steel.
By late 1943, the war in the South Pacific had changed its rhythm. The grand, terrifying clashes of battleships and cruisers were fading. The Imperial Japanese Navy, bleeding from the wounds inflicted at Guadalcanal and Midway, could no longer afford to sacrifice its destroyers to resupply its starving garrisons. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. But the Japanese army in New Guinea, hundreds of thousands of men trapped in the steaming malaria-ridden jungles, still needed to eat. They needed bullets. They needed quinine. To keep them alive, the Japanese changed tactics. They turned to the Daihatsu-class barge. These were 50-foot, diesel-powered, flat-bottomed vessels made of steel. They were ugly, slow, and unglamorous, but they were perfect for the job. They could hug the coastline, slipping under the overhanging mangroves where American aircraft couldn't see them and American destroyers couldn't follow. They moved at night, a ghostly flotilla carrying the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. For the PT boats, this presented a maddening problem. The PT boat was designed to kill giants. Its primary weapon, the Mark 8 torpedo, was built to crack the hull of a 10,000-ton cruiser. Against a shallow draft barge, it was useless. The torpedoes would simply run underneath the flat bottoms without detonating, or worse, fail to lock on to the small wooden and steel targets. The crews of the PT squadrons in New Guinea realized they were fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons, so they improvised. In primitive workshops along the coast, the Mosquito Fleet underwent a savage transformation. The crews stripped off the heavy torpedo tubes. In their place, they bolted on anything that could spit fire. They scrounged 37mm automatic cannons from the noses of wrecked P-39 Airacobra fighter planes and lashed them to the foredecks. They installed 40mm Bofors guns meant for anti-aircraft defense. They added extra .50 caliber machine guns until the boats bristled like porcupines. They stopped being torpedo boats. They became gunboats. The barge busters were born. The nightly patrols became a brutal, intimate form of warfare. There was no radar to guide them in the clutter of the coastline. The PT skippers had to steer by the silhouette of the mountains against the stars, risking the jagged coral reefs that could tear their wooden hulls apart. They hunted by sound. They would cut their engines and drift, listening for the distinctive thump, thump, thump of the Japanese diesel engines echoing across the water. When the fight started, it was ferocious and short. It wasn't a naval battle, it was a knife fight in a phone booth. The PT boats would roar out of the darkness, closing to within 50 yards, so close the Americans could hear the Japanese officers shouting orders, "Open up!" The night would disintegrate into a blinding storm of tracer fire. The 37mm cannons punched jagged holes through the steel armor of the barges. The .50 calibers turned the wooden decks into splinters. The Japanese barge crews fought back desperately with their own machine guns and rifles, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of American firepower. The water would churn with explosions as fuel drums on the barges ignited. The sea would be littered with floating rice bags, crates of ammunition, and the bodies of enemy soldiers. This wasn't the glory of sinking a battleship. It was grim, dirty work, but it was devastatingly effective. By early 1944, the impact of the barge busters was being felt on the shore. Japanese diaries captured later spoke of the green dragons that ruled the night. Soldiers on the front lines in New Guinea began to starve. Their ammunition pouches were empty. The wounded died without medicine. The PT boats had done what the battleships couldn't. They had strangled the enemy's supply line, turning the Japanese army's occupation into a slow, agonizing death sentence. The toy boats had become the executioners of the New Guinea coast.
October 24, 1944. The night air in the Surigao Strait was heavy, charged with the electricity of a gathering storm. Lightning flickered across the black water, illuminating the jagged coastlines of Leyte and Dinagat. 2 years earlier, the remnants of the Mosquito Fleet had been chased out of these waters, leaving behind a conquered nation and a promise: I shall return. Now they were back. But this time, they were not a desperate handful of refugees. They were a swarm. 39 PT boats bobbed in the rough swells, arranged in a gauntlet stretching deep into the throat of the strait. They were the first line of defense, the tripwire for the greatest naval ambush in history. South of them, steaming relentlessly into the trap, was the Japanese Southern Force. It was a fleet of nightmares, led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. At its heart were 2 massive battleships, the Fuso and the Yamashiro, steel leviathans armed with 14-inch guns, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. Nishimura knew he was sailing into a death trap. He was the bait, a sacrifice to draw the American fleet away from the carriers to the north. But he steamed on, adhering to the code of Bushido. At 22:36 hours, the radar on PT-131 blipped. A contact, a big one. The section leader, Peter Gadd, peered into the rain-lashed darkness. Prepare to engage. It was a suicidal mismatch. Plywood boats against battleships. But as the Japanese column entered the strait, the PT boats did what they were built to do. They didn't run, they charged. From the shadows of the islands, the roar of Packard engines shattered the silence. The Ronin, the masterless warriors of the sea, hurled themselves at the Imperial fleet. Suddenly, the night exploded. The Japanese ships, spotting the incoming wakes, unleashed their searchlights. Beams of blinding white light swept the water, pinning the tiny boats against the black ocean. Then came the shells. The water around the PT boats erupted in geysers of white foam as the battleship's secondary batteries opened fire. "Make smoke! Make smoke!" the radio crackled. The PT boats zigzagged wildly, laying down thick screens of chemical smoke to blind the enemy gunners. They close to within point-blank range, launching their torpedoes into the chaos. The Yamashiro and Fuso fought back like wounded dragons. Their massive guns roared, the concussions shaking the very hulls of the American boats. Several PTs were hit. PT-493 took a direct hit to the chart house, killing 2 men and wounding the skipper, but they kept firing. In the confusion of the storm and the smoke, most of the PT torpedoes missed or failed to detonate, but they had achieved something far more critical than a kill. They had blinded Nishimura. They had harassed him, confused his formation, and most importantly, they had radioed his exact position, speed, and course to the main American fleet waiting further up the strait. Because of the PT boats, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf knew exactly when and where the Japanese would arrive. He had lined up his own battleships and destroyers across the top of the strait, crossing the T, the ultimate naval maneuver.
As the battered Japanese fleet pushed past the PT boat gauntlet, thinking they had survived the worst, they sailed straight into hell. The American destroyers unleashed a wall of torpedoes, followed by the apocalyptic broadsides of 6 battleships. The Fuso was blown in half, the Yamashiro was obliterated, the Japanese southern force ceased to exist. As dawn broke on October 25th, the Surigao Strait was a graveyard of burning oil and debris. The PT boats, battered and low on fuel, patrolled the wreckage. They had come full circle. In 1942, they were the last line of defense in a losing war. In 1944, they were the tip of the spear in the final victory. The Devil boats had returned to the Philippines, and they had delivered on the promise. The giants had been slain by the sword. The waters of the Pacific belonged to them once more.